All right, well, welcome back. Hopefully Module 1 went well. Again, if you have any questions or things didn't work out too well, by all means, feel free to contact me. This week, we're moving on to the next part of our first unit, the search for God. So to recap a little bit, last module, we talked about, what are we meant for? What is our purpose? We talked about the fact that we're made into being by God, that our purpose is to know God, to do good according to His will, to love God, and to be in a relationship with God. And it's a pretty sweet deal that God actually wants to be in a relationship with us, and He wants us to find perfect happiness, not to just settle for imperfect happiness. And I think all of us would want that. I think all of us want to be loved. All of us want to have happiness. But sometimes we have trust issues in a relationship. Sometimes we get hurt in a relationship, so it might keep us from starting a new relationship again. And so same thing might happen for God. We might think of, well, is God really there? Well, if I follow God, am I going to be let down? So part of it is, this all comes together in an idea of what we say the search for God. So how do I know, God, that you're there? All right, how can I trust, God, that you're there, especially if you're asking me to give my life to you, which is ultimately what God is asking us in a relationship. So this week we're going to look at how do people search for God, how have people searched for God, and what are some of the conclusions they found to kind of help us out in our search for God in theology. All right. So there's more to life, right? The age-old cliche questions. What is the meaning of life? Where did everything come from? Why is everything such a precise degree? I mean, have you ever thought about that? There's a great scientist, Patrick Glenn, who lists all these different precise measurements in the world, that if something were just changed by a minuscule amount, we couldn't have life on Earth, and it couldn't function and exist. And so that perfection gets people asking these questions. Well, where did this come from? Why is it like this? Yes, we can quantify things. Yes, we can measure things. But what's our purpose? Can that be measured? Well, why me? I think one of the examples I love to think about is our fingerprints. So there's no two people who have the exact same fingerprints in the world. Well, why? Why is that even a thing? Is that based on survival? Why is it that we are so different and so unique? And we may wrestle with these questions in a lot of different ways, especially if we even doubt our own self-worth. At times we might struggle with fitting in. We might struggle with different friendships, with our family. We may have problems with our family as well, depending where we're coming from. So sometimes we really struggle with, am I worth it? And the resounding answer that God gives us is yes. St. John Paul II once says, we're not the sum of our mistakes, we're the sum of the Father's love for us. So when we're searching for God, we're hopefully searching and realizing, yes, we have purpose. Yes, our life has meaning. But what is that meaning? Or where did that purpose come from? So this desire to want to know is what ultimately is going to lead us to discover God. That because God, as the Catechism tells us, we read this in the UCAT, God has placed that longing on our heart. So if we look at God as an artist, every artist leaves their mark on their artwork. God willed us into being, we're going to talk about, and so He's left our mark on our souls. And so that mark, whether we've grown up religious or not, makes us and drives us to maybe ask these questions. And that's God's mark on us saying, all right, I want you to come to know me, and you can come to know me by discovering this truth. So let's look at how different people throughout the world have tried to search for God. When we think of the search for God, we might think of religion, this idea of practices, sets of beliefs. It can be very structured, it can be very loose, but really a search for what is a sense of the sacred or the divine or something greater than us. Is there more to us than just, or is there more to life than just us? So this search has been going on for centuries, and it still goes on. And it kind of manifests its way in different belief systems, doctrines, rituals that put into practice these beliefs. And so all this kind of put together loosely we call religion. So traditionally there have been different kinds of religions or religious categories. We may think of monotheism, mono meaning one, so the belief in one God. When we think of monotheism, we might think of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the three Abrahamic religions, who come from Abraham, who we're going to learn about, who all believe in one God. Polytheism, so poly, the prefix meaning many, We might think of the Greek gods, Norse gods, Roman gods, who had multiple gods, sky Zeus, or of the sea Neptune. When we think of pantheism, so the belief that God is in nature, or that nature is God. We might think of agnosticism, so the question of, I'm not sure if God is real, but I can't prove that he isn't either, or that God isn't real either. So this grappling, this question of whether or not God is really real. And then atheism, belief that there is no God, there is no divine, there is no sense of the sacred at all. This is also a belief system. If you think of religion as a set of beliefs that people ascribe themselves to and live their lives in conjunction with those beliefs, I mean, these are all religions. And so in that regard, regardless of what we practice, we're all religious in some way, shape, or form. We all have a set of beliefs we ascribe to. We all might have practices that reflect that. Some of us are more formal than others, but we're all religious to some degree. So consider yourself welcome, regardless of how you identify in your religious background. We're all in this journey really together. Right? So we kind of mentioned this a little bit in the first module when we're talking about an intro to theology and using the four sources of theology. But if we're going to look at this from a Christian perspective, because this is an intro to theology and Catholic theology, really the place we start is not where you think. You know, a lot of people say, well, I want to learn about God, so let me read the Bible. And that's great. The Bible is a great place to go. Or I want to learn about God, so let me go to church. That's great. That's another great place to go. That's actually not where Catholic theology, though, says that we should start. And again, when we look back in the Catechism, it talks about man, meaning all of humanity, can come to know God by their reason. That means by our intellect, what we think, how we reason things. God is there, and we can come to rationalize and understand God before we ever touch Scripture or tradition. So really for the time being, and in this module and the next module, we're really going to focus on what we call the natural law. So there's divine revelation and natural law. Divine revelation, we're going to learn a couple modules, but for the time being, to give us a sense of what we're talking about, divine revelation refers to how God communicates himself and reveals himself to us, primarily in Scripture and tradition. What we're going to be looking at the next couple modules is what we call the natural law. So the natural law is really what us as humans can discover naturally about what it means to be a human person, who God is, apart from divine revelation. So apart from the Bible and apart from the church's tradition. That we, just by being human, can know something about who put us into being, God. So hopefully it broadens our openness. So let's look at our experiences. Let's look at our daily life. Let's look at the world around us. All these things can tell us something about God if we're open to it and can look at it that way. So that means there are a lot of things that we quantify, but there's a lot of things we can't. What's the math equation for beauty? You know, we see a sunset and that might spark an emotion in us. I mean, we can talk about the synapses in our brain and that causes reactions, but why do some of us find certain things beautiful and others not? There's no equation for that we can simply reduce it to, well, this is why and this is why. What about love? You know, why do certain people fall in love? You know, yes, we can talk about the need for a relationship, and we can talk about the survival need of having a spouse. But I think any of us who have been in a loving relationship and anyone who's been married and you talk to your family, I mean, they probably wouldn't give you that as their complete answer. And a lot of them would probably say, well, I don't know, it's kind of undescribable. So I think if we start looking at the world around us, we look at beauty, if we look at love, we can start seeing that there are things about existence that are a lot deeper than just an equation or just a method that is going to want me to explore more. And it's really in these things, love, beauty, that's where we can find God. That's where we can find the sacred. So let's look there, all right? Don't be afraid to look there. So in walks St. Thomas Aquinas. I don't know if you've ever heard of Thomas Aquinas, but he was a Dominican friar from the 1200s. He was nicknamed the Dumb Ox because, and forgive me, St. Thomas, but he was kind of a bigger individual. He was quiet and shy, so people kind of wrote him off as someone who wasn't that intelligent. Well, he was everything but, and actually ended up being, and still is, one of the most brilliant minds that Western civilization has ever produced. He's written a plethora, plenty of different works on not just theology, but philosophy and reason. He became famous because he brought Aristotle's philosophy, Aristotle, the great ancient Greek philosopher, to Europe to help explain Catholic theology. In this form of using Aristotle's philosophy with theology, we call it Thomism, which is unique to St. Thomas Aquinas. He's unique because he joins this idea of reason and faith in what is called the scholastic method. So this inquiry-based learning, if you will. So I'm going to look at a question. I'm going to debate that question. I'm going to look at the answers to the question. I'm going to test those answers, and I'm going to come to a conclusion. We might think it very similar to the scientific method in the realm of science and biology. In the same way, in philosophy, the scholastic method tries to grapple with these questions, and so that's what he did. His most famous work was the Summa Theologica. It's Latin for a summary of theology. And he was brilliant. He has about several different volumes within this work, and he would dictate to scribes. And so he would dictate simultaneously, one scribe on angels, one on God, one on the saints, one on Jesus. Oh, I remembered something about God, so I'm going to go back there. And he would just go back and forth, dictating as this brilliant mind. And really why he's famous and why we're looking at him here is because he used reason alone to search for God. And he created what we call these 5 proofs for the existence of God using reason alone. So let's take a look at them. So this is how Aquinas searched for God. So these are Aquinas' 5 proofs, and as part of the reading is looking at them, but let's break it down a little bit more. So this first proof is what I call the unmoved mover. So it's that God is what set existence into motion. So if we think of the laws of physics, an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon by a greater force. So most physicists today believe that the universe is expanding. So if you think of a balloon, you blow up a balloon, it started at a small point and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as it grew. Well, go look at the inverse. It gets smaller, 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 smaller until you get to an original point. Well, if the universe is expanding at any rate greater than 0, then that means it originally had to come from a point. It gets bigger and bigger, think of the other way. It goes smaller, smaller, smaller. Well, something can't move itself according to the laws of physics. It has to be acted on by a force. So what is that force? So for Aquinas, that force is God. Causation. So it's kind of this idea of cause and effect. So you can't get something from literally nothing. Yes, we might think of evolution as a process. Yes, we might think of the Big Bang Theory. But even that, what set off the Big Bang? Where did those materials come from? I mean, think about it. You can reduce it. Well, atoms, and we'll go smaller than that. Eventually, you're going to get to this point where there's nothing. Well, you can't get something from genuine nothingness. That's what makes nothing, well, nothing. So how does this all come to be from absolute nothing? If we think of our DNA, scientists call DNA the book of life. And when our DNA develops, it basically is this program, and that's why it's called the book of life, that has all this information that is going to help our body develop and know what to do and to form. Where does all that come from? Yes, we may think of evolution, but at the same time, to say that just came out of nothing is like to say I'm going to take this book with all its pages and all its words and all the pictures in it, and then it just dropped from the sky, and it's all perfective intricacy. Well, how can our DNA it can't just drop from the sky? And even a process of movement, like evolution or the Big Bang, originally has to have an initial cause. So what is that cause? For Aquinas, that's God. Contingency. So everything is dependent on something else to exist. Ultimately, everything is dependent on something else. So the creation of this PowerPoint was contingent on me, and me being able to do it was contingent on me learning how to do it. So it just doesn't kind of, again, fall out of thin air. We're all dependent or relying. Even ourselves, we didn't make ourselves. Our parents created us, biologically speaking. So all of us are contingent on someone else or something else. So look at it on a big scale. Look at existence. Existence ultimately has to be contingent on something else, something greater, relying on it. For Aquinas, that's God. Supreme model. This one's a little interesting. So if you're not really sure about this one, by all means, in the discussion board, raise it up. So the idea of the supreme model is Aquinas is saying that to know that something is true, like perfection, there has to be some kind of ultimate model to allow us to know that that's what perfect is to begin with. So for example, and don't take this personally, I'm going to grade you in school. So there might be assessments, a paper, a project. Well, what do I know what's an A project? What do I know what's an A paper? I already have to have an understanding of what I'm expecting from you to be able to grade you. Otherwise, you could turn everything in and I could just be like, oh, you get an A and you get an F and you get a B. It doesn't work that way, I promise. Trust me. I have in my mind already an understanding of, well, this is what I'm hoping to see. This is the standard, like a ruler, that I'm going to use to measure what's an A paper and what's an F paper. So to even know what an A and F paper is, I have to have that ruler, that standard already in my mind. So for Aquinas, what he's saying is, how do we know that something is, what beauty is? How do we know something is perfect, or that there's even such a thing as beauty or such a thing as perfection? Well, ultimately, we have to have an ultimate model that is beauty itself, or perfection itself. And so for Aquinas, that's God. And lastly, intelligent design, which a lot of us might already be familiar with, this idea of the intricacy of the world, or that everything works so meticulously together in existence to uphold human life or intelligent life. And that, again, cannot just drop out of anywhere. Yes, again, there is this idea of a growth and evolution, but how can that just happen from a spontaneous eruption? There has to be some order, something being guided where it leads to this intelligence and this perfection that we have, other than to simply say it just happened by chance. Quite frankly, it takes more faith to believe that all this just happened by chance than to think that there's actually some intelligent design at work. So for Aquinas, that was his last proof, saying this couldn't have happened simply by chance. It's too big of a coincidence to think that all of this universe just happens by chance. And so for him, this was a point, again, for God. So for Aquinas, then, we have these kind of points of describing or characteristics of God. So based on all of this, based on his understanding of who God is, Aquinas says God is unique. There's only one of God. There's nothing else like God. That God is immutable, holy, infinite. That he is a creator. He put everything into being. That he's omnipotent and omnipresent. That he is not confined by anything, and he is everywhere at all times. That he's eternal. He had no beginning and he had no end. That he contains all things. That means everything gets its source of being from him. That God is alive. That he's not out there, or that he's dead, or that he started things and kind of fizzles out of being, but that rather he is still in existence. When we get to the Old Testament, we'll see that one of the ways that God revealed himself to Moses was saying, I am who I am. What he basically is saying is, I am existence. I am to be. What existence is itself. And so in this way, God is all around us. So you can start seeing real quickly that for Aquinas and for Catholic theology, God isn't just this puppeteer controlling things and that just put everything into a nice little package already pre-made. But rather that God has set things into motion and continues to guide and mold all of existence, because God is in everything. It's a little mind-blowing, but that's why we say God is a mystery. So our last thing, so again, if we look at this as a relationship, how do we respond? I love this quote: faith is the bridge between where I am and the place God is taking me. Think of that as part of the journey. So how can I take this, especially if I feel like I can't quantify this, and I don't want to just take it on faith? Well, think of faith as this: we might have faith in other people, may have faith in ourselves. What does that mean? Is that we believe in other people, we believe in ourselves, we believe that this can happen. And at least for faith in God, if we look around ourselves, we can say, well, I may not have it all understood, but I can see the beauty of creation before me. I can see the intricacy before me. And there are certain questions that, at least in my lifetime, I may not be answering. But I cannot ignore the intricacy of creation. I can't ignore this idea of expansion and an original unmoved mover. So I'm going to have some level of trust. I mean, there's a level of trust in the sciences. There's a level of trust in really every matter of subject area. So how can I trust, and how can I develop that gift of faith when it comes to theology as well? Faith is really what keeps that relationship with God alive. He invites us into that relationship, to be in that relationship. And just like someone who texts you and invites you into a relationship, hopefully you're going to text them back. You're not just going to, blow them off. Because he invites us, it asks for a response. That response for us is very simply faith. It's a virtue. A virtue is a good habit. It means it's something we have to practice and work at. So faith is something we have to work at too. And faith allows us to believe in God, to trust in God, and to trust what He's promised us. So to have faith is ultimately to respond to God's invitation, and to trust that what God desires for us, perfect happiness, love, fulfillment, is true, even if we haven't have all our questions answered. So I invite you to keep that faith, even if you still have a lot of questions, even if some of these things are not making sense, and even if you feel like you don't have it all together yet. Don't give up. Have that faith and to trust in God and to ask God for that clarity to understand, God, show yourself to me in the world around me. All right? Until next time, have a good reading.